Green Party co-leader James Shaw was caught unawares at the weekend by a vote at the party's AGM which turfed him out of the job. He now has to stand again to win back the co-leadership. I'm joined by NBR columnist Bridget Morton.
Hi, Brad.
So, the Green Party, is this another National Party leadership or Labour Party leadership kerfuffle, or how do you see it?
I don't think it's quite, as turgid as the sort of Labour Party and National Party, last decades, basically. But it does show a really good sign that whilst the Greens have been pretty stable as a party, they're not immune to leadership challenges.
Is this a leadership challenge in the way that we would normally... And noting that, as far as I can tell, some of the key people seen as possible challenges have all said they're not standing. So, it is possible in the end that James Shaw will have no one to face, possibly.
Yeah, but it's looking more and more like he won't have anyone to face, or if it is, it'll be somebody that is sort of a not well-known member of the party, because they don't need to be a sitting MP, unlike most of the other parties where they choose their leader from the caucus. For the Greens, they don't have to actually have a sitting MP to be their leader, so it could be someone from the wider party that puts their hand up, and that's relatively unknown because we don't know who they are. Probably most Green members don't know who they are, but that doesn't rule out it happening.
In the case of Labour and National, if you generally look at leadership challenges, it's normally driven by opinion polls. Normally the party isn't doing so well in the polls. MPs start to look around, get nervous and think they've got to change the leader. And then on top of that comes obviously personal ambition of those who want the job. It's not the case here with the Greens though, is it?
Well, no, it's not, because their vote has been pretty steady, and James Shaw's popularity has been pretty steady in terms of those polls. So I don't think it's necessarily opinion poll driven, but it seems to be more sort of policy driven, in that they don't feel he's gone hard enough on certain policy areas, which always, I think, does play a part in sort of Labour and National leadership challenges. Whilst we sort of tend to look at them just through a poll lens, often there it's actually a direction of travel that the leader has chosen that puts most of the caucus offside, rather than just the opinion polls.
How fair do you think that is? Because if you look at by any measure, the Greens have achieved more on climate change in the last 4 to 5 years than they did previously.
Yeah, and this is always the danger. You're asking me, someone that highly respects James Shaw, thinks he's a good leader, but I'm not going to vote Green. And they need people, to vote Green. So appealing to someone like me doesn't really work. And I think that's some of the problem.
I suppose you're reinforcing the minds of those who oppose him why they should get rid of him.
Yes, quite possibly. Quite possibly. So that's what it comes down to. If he's someone that is, agreeable to someone like me that sits on the right, clearly there's an issue going on that perhaps he doesn't represent the views of the party as much as they want him to.
And then that comes down to an argument around strategism, because James Shaw himself has said a number of times he's frustrated with the time it's taken and the fact that he hasn't got enough in terms of making progress on climate change. But he's also been very clear about wanting to win broad political support, not just from Labour, but from National, which generally he has managed to do. There's been negotiations. So there seems to be a disagreement around strategy. But by winning that National Party support, if there's a change of government at the next election, which is a good chance of that based on the polls, then not a lot of what he's done won't change, will it?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a win that they can mark up. But they've obviously got to see that, probably from their point of view, that this is their opportunity, because if the government does change, to get as much done as possible and lock in as much as possible. I think there's probably a bit of naivety amongst some of the party bases, as there are in all lay parties, about what actually can be achieved in Wellington and how hard it is, particularly when you've got a compromise, to get things through that machinery of government.
Is there, though, a personal element to it? It does seem clear that there are people within the Green Party who just don't like James Shaw.
Yeah, and that's always going to come down to it as well. Personality does matter, and I think in an MMP environment, personality matters, even more. It is a key part of the brand, and a lot of people vote on who the leaders of a party are, rather than just what the party stands for. Because
the argument that they've put up is that he's not getting enough done on climate change, and that the Greens' push on climate change isn't being, But Marama Davidson, who most seem to really support, but if you look at her involvement as a minister around sort of housing, homelessness and the sorts of areas she's involved in, you could equally argue not a lot of progress being made there.
Well, I think I would not equally argue. I would argue that she has not made any progress compared to James Shaw. It's hard to see anything that she's actually done that has made one person, have a secure roof over their head, which means, as a minister in charge of homelessness, what has she actually achieved?
But then does that bring us back to the question, though, is it simply a matter around policy differences and principles by targeting James Shaw, given no one targeted Marama Davidson?
Well, yeah, clearly we've got a personality element there as well. And whilst they're arguing it's on the basis of policy and principles, there's clearly some people that don't have a problem with Marama Davidson and do have a problem with the personality of James Shaw. I think there's always been a bit of a pushback. He wears a suit, he used to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Those sort of, I suppose, red flags to the sort of activist base has always been a problem.
Division and disunity for both Labour and National is normally, it really does ruin their chances, electoral chances, elections. We know that. Is this sort of, at the moment, clear division that we're seeing, is that going to have any negative impact for the Greens?
Well, I think it could go two ways. At the moment, it looks like James Shaw will be re-elected. So if he is re-elected, he's probably got to demonstrate that he is pushing harder back against the government, pushing further into that climate change space. And if he doesn't, I think he's going to have probably this same fight next year in an election year, which is what you don't want. There's possibly also a group of people in the party who, if they don't see, a change in leadership, may choose to sort of go off. We always see a flurry of smaller and sort of minor parties come up in an election year. We may see some of those splintering off as well.
What about the implications for Labour? Obviously, if the results at the next election left Labour in a position where they could form a government again, but clearly to do that, they would definitely need the support of the Greens.
Yeah, it definitely makes it trickier for them. You saw that, the Prime Minister came out within hours and promised that even if James Shaw lost the leadership bid, that he would still continue to be the Climate Change Minister, which is quite interesting because it's taking a lot of the agency away from the Green Party and, the most democratic party, as they call themselves, to not be able to choose kind of who they have within cabinet. It's quite an interesting choice. But also it means that you can clearly see that Jacinda Ardern sees James Shaw as someone that she can work with, that it doesn't kind of scare the horses of the more centrist voters. On both sides of politics, there's always a bit of a play to show, well, look, Labour will get pulled way to the left by the Greens, and on the right, National get way to the right by ACT. That's always, a danger that they've got to try and hold off for that centre vote. So James Shaw, appeals kind of that centre voter, and so clearly for Jacinda Ardern, she wants that as the leadership.
But also goes to the point that Labour in its own has its own majority. It doesn't need the Greens to govern now, which in a sense makes James Shaw's perhaps achievement even more significant, that he's managed to make progress even when actually Labour doesn't need the Greens vote.
Yeah, I mean, he made a lot of this progress in the last Parliament when they didn't have the majority vote, so I think, it was a slightly different circumstance. But nobody in MMP environment can be so short-term to say, well, I've got the votes today, so I don't need your votes ever. Clearly, Labour can see they're not going to have, at the very least, a majority next year. Therefore, they're going to have to work with a coalition partner. By and large, the most likely one is the Greens.
Bridget Morton, thank you for your time.
Thanks.